Hello and welcome to part two of our PowerPoint presentation on strategic active listening. I'm Dr. Randy Wilt. And if you listened to part one, this is going to help you to understand more about listening. If you've not heard part one before now, please go back and listen to it. Just to kind of go in there and just to summarize a little bit about part one. Part one is telling you that there is a major difference between hearing and listening. If you remember, I gave you the example of someone who spoke German. If you understood German, great, that's listening. But if you did not speak German, all you're doing is hearing noises. So for example, if you heard the word Achtung, which means attention, in English, that's the German translation or English translation. If you heard Achtung, you would know that that meant attention. So you're listening and you have that memory of what it means and you're applying it to it. But if you do not speak German at all and you heard the word Achtung, you wouldn't know anything. It's just a noise to you, just like if you heard Auf Wiedersehen. That would just be a noise. You have to listen and have those meanings that are back in your memory bank that you can apply to the sound, to the noise, to actually make it into a content so you understand it. So active listening is concentrating on what is being said rather than just passively hearing a message. So just hearing the sounds of Achtung is the same as if I was sitting here talking to you, you've zoned out. All you're doing is hearing noise. You have to listen to pick up the meaning of what I am saying. Did you know this? Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. Most of us listen with the intent to reply. There are certain principles of listening, and we're going to go through those very quickly. The first one is stop talking. Don't talk, but listen. Listen to what they're saying. Do not interrupt. Do not talk over them. Do not try to finish their sentences. You got to just listen to them. I'm going to give you the example. Back when I was working on my PhD, there were two people in my PhD cohort. One was from Israel and the other one was from Japan. Okay, this is called the Jewish-Japanese factor. It has nothing to do with them in love with each other. No, they did not fall in love, and this is not an actual picture. But it shows you something kind of interesting because I want to give you the example of what happened. I was actually sitting there mediating a disagreement between these two. It was a Jewish boy and a Japanese girl. The Japanese girl, they worked on the same team, but they couldn't get along with it. And the reason why is because the Jewish boy said that the Japanese girl was not doing her work, and she said he was not doing his work. And the way the whole mediation went is that I would say to the Jewish boy from Israel, tell me what the problems are. You tell me the problem. So I would turn to the Japanese girl and say, tell me what you think the problems are. She would start saying, well, the problems are that he would, and before she got any further along, he would interrupt and say, but this is not what I did. And she would just clam up. She would stop talking altogether. So then I'll go back over and ask him to say something, and he would make a comment, and she would be very quiet about it. So then I'll go back over and ask her, and as soon as she started talking, he would interrupt her. And finally, I'm kind of like, okay, it's time for a caucus. A caucus in mediation means that you stop talking, you put them in different rooms, you go talk to each one individually. So I go over to the first room where she is, and I say, why is it that you just stop talking? When he interrupts you, you just stop talking. You need to kind of stand up there and just kind of keep talking. Just maybe interrupt him. And she said, well, now hold it. That's not my culture. It's very rude to interrupt. When someone interrupts you, you stop talking and you let them talk. And I said, okay, but he keeps interrupting you. And she said, but it's rude if I go back and talk on top of him. So I went back over to his room and I said, why are you interrupting so much? Let her talk. And he said, well, you don't understand. In a Middle Eastern culture, when you interrupt and talk on top, which is called overtalk, that means you're engaged, that it's meaningful to you, that you're trying to keep the conversation going. And he said, it really kind of irritated me because every time I started to talk, she would stop talking, which means that she's not engaging. Matter of fact, she's being very rude. And I said, well, she thinks you're being rude because you're interrupting her. And he goes, no. I am trying to engage her. she's being rude because she will not engage back. I was, oh my gosh, okay, now I understand. We've got two complete different cultures. So this whole concept about stop talking doesn't always work depending upon the culture. But we're talking about an American culture right now. As you know, in American culture, that when someone's talking, you got to stop talking, do not interrupt, listen to everything that's being said before you can evaluate, interpret, and then respond to it. Number two, wait and watch for nonverbal communications. You said, what does that have to do with listening? Well, actually, what it's doing, that those nonverbals are putting meaning to what you're hearing, and that's allowing you to listen and create the context. So, for example, the gestures, the facial expressions, the eye movement, all these things are very important. You pick up so much in the nonverbal. So when someone's talking to you, remember, and you probably, if you didn't watch part one, you didn't hear this, but when I was talking about my doctor friend who was looking down when I talked to him, I felt like he was disinterested. And later he told me, he said, now we've learned in med school that when someone's talking, to look them in the eye and look for nonverbals. You know, for example, have you ever had someone who's sitting there, they're saying, I'm really hurt by this, but at the same time they're smiling? That's called disconnect. Okay, how can you be hurt and smiling at the same time? You should have a sad face if you're hurt. So watching for those nonverbals can also help you to put content and context to the message. The next one there is listen for ideas, not just for words. If you listen for ideas, you will see the whole picture. But if you're listening just at specific words and not the whole idea, the whole concept behind there, all you're doing is getting certain words that may actually mislead you. Now, I want to tell you about something that's called the way the British talk that's different from Americans. The British will do what we call words of understatement. You say, what's that? Words of understatement. Well, you see, I put in there, I put some words. Bunch, love, super, very much, many, a lot of. The British will use what we consider the understatement words. So, for example, we will use a word like super. This is super important. You did a super good job on the assignment, or I did super running track today. But when the British talk, they will understate it. They will say, instead of super, they'll say things like quite, or rather, or fairly. This is fairly important. You did quite well on your assignment, or I did rather good running track today. Now, you say, what does this have to do with the listening? You can tell a lot by not just the word, but trying to read everything into the word. So, for example, if someone says, this is super important, or this is fairly important, just listening to the word super or fairly is not necessarily going to give you what you need to know about the contextual meaning of that statement. You've got to hear the whole thing. You've got to look at the person, understand the nonverbals, look at their culture. Someone who says this is fairly important, maybe it's actually more important than you think it is. So this is why you can't just look at a word. You've got to look at the whole context around the word. Here's another set. Love, really like. I love the way the food tastes, or I really like my professor. Let's look with the British. I enjoy, appreciate. I enjoy the way the food tastes, or I really appreciate my professor. I rather appreciate my professor. Okay, so I really like my professor, or I rather appreciate my professor. Are they the same? Well, actually they are. Different cultures say it different ways. So if you're looking at just a word where, why isn't he saying really like? Why is he saying rather appreciate? If you're looking just at the words, you actually can misinterpret what's being said if you don't also think about the culture and the nonverbal. And talking about words, let's look at some words that are kind of interesting. In American English, we use words like okay, change, problem, wonderful, tell me more, try to get. In British English, they'll use, instead of okay, they'll say certainly. Change, they'll use modify. Problems, they'll use complications. Wonderful, sensational. Tell me more, can you elaborate? So here we go again. You can misinterpret by looking purely at the word instead of completely looking at the whole concept. Next, I want to talk about our sources of difficulty by the listener. So here are some things that can cause you to be a lousy listener. Number one, you're being preoccupied and not listening. You probably have done this before. that you've walked in. I've done this. I've had students come in my office. They want to talk about something, and I'm sitting there thinking about the course I'm ready to go teach. Am I prepared with a lecture? So I'm very preoccupied, so I'm not listening. Number two, being so interested in what you have to say that you listen mainly to find the opening to get the floor. So this is that person who is just looking to get in there and to get on their soapbox and just express their thoughts instead of really listening to what the other person says. And that's called getting the floor. Formulating, listening to your own rebuttal to what the speaker is trying to say. So a difficulty of the listener is that when they're hearing things, they stop listening. You probably have heard this before. They stop listening to come up with their own rebuttal. So for example, if I was to sit there and to start talking to you and you for just a moment start thinking about, oh, what am I going to eat tonight? I wonder if I'm going to go to Kentucky Fried Chicken or Chick-fil-A or some other chicken place. Okay, that 4 or 5 seconds that you were thinking about that, actually I could have said something about that. This lecture is has no testing or anything else, so don't worry about it. Okay, so you could have stopped listening because you're preoccupied, but you could have also stopped listening because you wanted to make a rebuttal. Next thing, listening for your own personal beliefs without what is being said. So here's a case where you've already made up your decision and you're not going to listen anymore. And just like that, evaluating, making a judgment before the speaker has finished the message. And the last one here is not asking for clarification when you know that you do not understand. This is very, very typical. And it's classic too, where you do not understand, but you're scared to ask a question because it makes you look smart? No, it makes you look stupid. So we have a tendency just to not ask questions, not to clarify, and that makes us into a lousy listener. And to finish off here, there are different types of non-listening. One of them is to listen selectively. You're only listening to what you want to. You're putting out things you're not interested. You're stealing words, where the listener is listening just enough to go in there and to grab onto a certain word, and then they launch into that topic or that part of the conversation. Next one is the defensive listener. They are already going to be defensive. They're ready to attack you. And I've known people like this before. Anytime I talk to them, I know they're going to attack me on something I say. And the last one here is the ambush listener, who they are listening not only to attack the other person, but they really want to ambush you, where the defensive listener is on the defensive and they're going to attack you. The ambush listener is there for one reason, to make you look bad. So, how to be a good active listener? You got to listen to understand. Look for the meanings. Don't look at the words. Look for the meanings. Just like if you remember in part 1, we talked about Beethoven. He was attaching different meanings to the music. Okay, number 2, look to make connections and links. Which basically that says is that just don't think there's one topic in there. Look for different topics and try to pull them together. And the last one is find meaning to remove personal and interpersonal biases. Never go into a conversation listening with your biases in there. But I do want to point out one thing to you, is that sometimes it doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to be a good listener. As you can see this picture here of President Bush. You know, when he had this here, he says, I cannot hear you. You got to speak up. Well, obviously, it's because he had the phone upside down. I hope you enjoyed this second part of active listening. And I certainly hope that some parts of it is going to help you as you continue with your career or your schooling. And always know this, that you can always Google active listening and find out what the most current trends are in active listening. Hey, y'all have a good day now.